Okay, and we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to SC for CJR, South Carolina for Criminal Justice Reform. We are so excited today. I have a special guest, Dr. Gregg Caruso. I'm going to be introducing him in a moment. And obviously, we're joined again by my illustrious co-host and Executive Board Member of South Carolina for Criminal Justice Reform, Tola Familoni. My name is Ali Menegakis. I'm the founder of South Carolina for Criminal Justice Reform. And as we always do, I'm just going to chat with you all a little bit about what SC for CJR is. So we were founded in this past January 2020, and we are a 100% grassroots, nonpartisan organization. We're dedicated to holistic criminal justice reform in South Carolina. We don't take any funding at this time. And as such, we depend 100% on grassroots volunteers like you guys. Our team is composed of criminal justice reform advocates from diverse backgrounds, including criminal defense attorneys, public defenders, former prosecutors, academics, formerly incarcerated individuals, and others who are passionate about criminal justice reform in our state. Our motto is fairness, awareness, and change, and we are dedicated to unveiling the injustices throughout each stage of the criminal justice system, the public ombudsman, researching and interviewing experts like solutions to such injustices, and ultimately coming reform. In recent weeks, following George Floyd, we have been. Am I having everyone hear me?
Can you guys hear me? Now I can.
Okay. Sorry, apologize, y'all. In the recent weeks following the death of George Floyd, we've been focusing a lot on policing and problems in policing. So today we have episode 3 of SC for CJR series, Dissecting Policing Problems and Solutions. And today we are focusing on, we have Dr. Gregg Caruso, I'm sorry, Gregg. Let me just introduce you briefly. Dr. Gregg Caruso is a professor of philosophy at SUNY Corning and honorary professor of philosophy at Macquarie University. He's also the co-director of the Justice Without Retribution Network at the University of Aberdeen School of Law. His research interests include free will, agency, and responsibility, both moral and legal, as well as philosophy of mind, cognitive science, neuroethics, moral psychology, criminal law, punishment, and public policy. His books include Rejecting Retributivism, Free Will, Punishment, and Criminal Justice from 2020, Just Desserts, Debating Free Will with Daniel Dennett from 2020, Free Will and Consciousness, Exploring the Illusion of Free Will and Moral Responsibility, Science and Religion, Neuroexistentialism, and I could go on. And what we're going to be doing is putting a link to all his works on our Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, so you all can check it out after our talk today. He also has been featured on a few TED Talks, which have been fun, so we'll send those too. But we're so honored to have you, Dr. Caruso. Thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah.
So, Dr. Caruso, I know that you consider yourself, and I don't claim to be in any way an expert when it comes to philosophy at all. Tola and I are both criminal defense attorneys, and that's where our focus is. But I know that you consider yourself to what you have called yourself an optimistic skeptic. Can you tell us what that is, and what do you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. So the majority of my work is focused on free will. But I've been doing a lot of work recently on criminal justice and punishment. And so I've been really interested as of late as the relationship between free will and criminal law and free will and theories of punishment and what it means for criminal justice. So I'm a free will skeptic. So as a free will skeptic, I maintain that who we are and what we do is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control. And I could talk about what kind of factors those might include. But because of that, we're never morally responsible for our actions in a very specific sense. It's called the sort of basic desert sense, the sense of moral responsibility that would make one is ultimately the result of factors truly deserving of praise and blame, punishment and reward. And so I'm optimistic about the implications of that view. So many people worry that if we give up this kind of notion of free will, if we give up the idea that individuals are morally responsible in this robust basic desert sense, that we would just have to let criminals go, free, or that it would be the end of morality, or that our interpersonal relationships would suffer. And so I've been systematically in my work going through different domains and essentially arguing for optimistic outcomes of adopting this kind of perspective. And the most recent project has been discussing its implications in criminal justice reform. So if I could just jump in with that, a little bit and tie it into what you guys are doing. The new book that I've just finished is called Rejecting Retributivism. And one of the things, if you look at, you guys are lawyers, so if you look at one of the primary justifications for legal punishment, both historically and currently, it's a retributive justification of punishment. And retributive punishment maintains that wrongdoers deserve to be punished in proportion to their crime. That is, since they are morally responsible agents, they have free will and presumably under the law, then they're morally responsible and legally responsible. They deserve to suffer for their wrongs, and regardless of whether it would have any forward-looking benefit. So that's one of the key parts of retributivism, is that an individual deserves to suffer simply for having done the wrongful act, knowingly, doing wrong, regardless of whether it would reduce crime, regardless of whether it would rehabilitate them or deter others. So generally, like, if you could think about forward-looking and backward-looking reasons for sort of punishing someone. And you might say, well, why should we punish an individual? One reason would be they deserve it. And that's kind of backward-looking. They deserve it because they've done wrong, period. I want retribution. They should be given their just deserts, right? You may have heard that phrase before. Forward-looking justifications look at things like rehabilitation and deterrence. So you might deter I might punish my daughter because I don't want her to engage in those kind of behaviors in the future. I want to deter her in the future from behaving in that way. So one of the things I argue in the book is against this kind of backward-looking retributive form of punishment. Ironically, I also argue against some of these forward-looking justifications for punishment. And so I've developed a kind of alternative model, which I call the public health quarantine model, which is a non-retributive, but also a non-punitive. It's not a punishment-based approach to addressing criminal behavior. So if I could go a little further with that, I mean, in the title, one of the things I suggested is that we need to replace our sort of current reactive approach to criminal justice with a preventive approach. And the kind of preventive approach I'm proposing is taking a public health approach to addressing criminal behavior. And the preventive approach focuses on both identifying and addressing the social determinants of crime. And the social determinants of crime, I argue, are essentially analogous to the social determinants of health. So when you think of like public health ethics in general, you might look at like child infant mortality rates in third world countries, or you might look at morbidity rates or type 2 diabetes, these various poor health outcomes. And one of the things public health organizations do is they identify the causes of those health inequalities or those poor health outcomes. They identify them, they prioritize them, and then they target them. And one of the big parts of this model is often what you'll see is that the causes of those poor health outcomes are issues of social justice. So like women's rights in third world countries might affect reproductive issues and infant mortality. Women may not have access to birth control, or they may not have reproductive control over their own bodies. And because of that, you might have higher infant mortality rates. And so to reduce the infant mortality rates, you might have to address the social injustice, in this case, kind of the sexist norms in that society. And what I've argued is that with regard to criminal justice, we can't have meaningful criminal justice reform without simultaneously addressing issues of social justice. And in doing so, what we really need to do is target what I call the social determinants of criminal behavior, which include things like poverty, low socioeconomic status, abuse and exposure to violence, mental illness, access to healthcare, access to housing, environmental health, nutrition, and education. Those are ones that I focus on in my book. And I show statistically through lots of different studies how the social determinants actually match up and correlate with incarceration rates, as well as numerous types of health outcomes. And so what we want to do what I offer as a kind of proposal is that we move away from this reactive approach to addressing crime, that one that focuses on punitive responses to agents who do wrong, right? So you did wrong, you're responsible for being the kind of person you are, for doing the kind of action you committed, and you deserve to suffer in this purely backward looking sense with like no regard for their rehabilitation or reintegration into society. And what I want to do is move away from that myopic focus on punishment and shift the focus to preventative programs and policies that target these social determinants and that address these social inequalities. So like we can't really address criminal justice reform without targeting things like racism, systemic inequality, educational inequity. And you can see how this movement that's happening right now with the number of people on the streets and the focus on both policing and reform of the policing, but also reform of prisons, is an acknowledgement that the current system isn't working. This kind of system that looks at individuals as simply bad, as broken, as morally decrepit because of their circumstances, and then targets them in a kind of reactive way. Whereas what I want to say is that individuals are the byproducts of luck. They're the byproducts of circumstances. I just am lucky enough not to have been born into the kind of low socioeconomic level that might cause systemic types of health inequalities, like type 2 diabetes, higher in poor communities. We know, here's just one statistic. We know, for example, that women in prison, 85 to 90% of them have been victims of abuse in the past. 85 to 90%. Now, they may have committed a criminal act to get into prison, but we have to begin to understand that the reasons why individuals are in those circumstances, there's no fine line, really. There is no black and white between victim and perpetrator. When you actually look at the data and you actually get your hands into the details, you'll realize that most offenders were victims themselves in the past, and this is particularly true with women who are incarcerated. 90% of them were either raped, domestically abused, child abuse in the past, or victims of some other kind of violence. And they may end up committing criminal acts of retaliation to their abuser, or in some kind of codependent relationship where there's drugs involved and there's addiction, but there's also domestic violence. And women are much more likely to take the fall in those types of cases. There are states with like no fault domestic dispute kinds of rules. So if you get called for a domestic dispute, they arrest both parties instead of trying to adjudicate who is responsible. The women become equally accountable for their own victimhood. And so the kind of holistic approach I want to propose is that we look at individuals holistically as embedded in social systems, as the byproduct of these kind of social determinants. And that we then target those social causes that drive criminal behavior instead of turning to reactive approaches like imprisonment. And just I'll end with this, and then we could talk. A lot of what the outcry is at the moment is yes, police brutality, George Floyd, and the kind of police violence that have and Black lives that have been Black youth that have been killed at the hands of police have focused our attention right now on things like, Freddie Gray and Eric Gardner and George Floyd have focused on police brutality. But the other end of that is mass incarceration, right? And Black and brown communities have been decimated equally by the over-policing of communities. And what we see is we have in the United States 4.5% of the world's population, relatively small part of the world's population. We house 25% of the world's prisoners. That's the highest rate of incarceration known to civilization. No other civilization has ever incarcerated that many human beings. So we incarcerate roughly 700 people for every 100,000. Compare that to Norway, Denmark, Sweden, certain Scandinavian countries. It hovers around 60 per 100,000. We're at 700 per 100,000. We literally incarcerate 10 times as many people as the Scandinavian countries. And not only do we incarcerate more people, we incarcerate for longer durations and in harsher conditions. Right, so 1 out of every 9 people in prison in the United States is serving a life sentence. That's 160 times greater than those that are serving life sentences in, say, the UK. And if you compare it to Norwegian countries, where 90% of criminal sentences are less than a year, and they don't even have life sentences. The max you could get in Norway is 21 years, even for murder. We disproportionately imprison large majority of our large portion of our population, disproportionately affecting African Americans, who make up over 1 million of the over 2 million people that are incarcerated in the United States. And we incarcerate in harsher conditions. We use things like solitary confinement. And here's the other part of the overall approach. The prison systems are designed for punitive purposes. They're not designed for rehabilitating or reintegrating individuals back into society. So again, if you look at individuals and you take this kind of retributive approach, that individuals deserve to suffer for their wrongs, well, you want to make their conditions as hard as possible. Or if you take a deterrence model, you might think we want to make prisons unpleasant places so as to deter individuals from, committing crime so they don't end up in prison. But because we treat prisons as punitive institutions, we ultimately dehumanize individuals. We remove their dignity. And as a result, we have one of the worst and highest rates of recidivism in the world. So 75% of prisoners upon release will be rearrested within 5 years. 78% will be rearrested within 6 years. 83% will be rearrested within 9 years. Almost 90%, right, of people are going to make their way back in the jail. And part of the reason is the way that we approach prisons in the United States is we house these individuals, we deprive them of education, of work training, of drug treatment, of mental health services. Then we release them and expect them to be model citizens. And as an outcome, we have one of the highest rates of recidivism. So one of the things I say is that even we want to prevent individuals from being incapacitated in the first place. But even for those, cases where maybe incapacitation is necessary for, like, let's say an extremely dangerous serial killer, the goal should always be rehabilitation and reintegration. And prisons need to be redesigned for the purpose of rehabilitation and reintegration. And I've even written in my work about prison design and how to design environments, the physical spaces in which we house individuals for those kinds of purposes. So yeah, I mean, I think that the focus right now on criminal justice reform is an important one. But I think the people who've been working on it, as you have and others for many years, know that the problems run deep, and it starts on the streets. It starts at the moment of the interaction with the police officer and the individual, and it extends throughout the system and throughout the prison experience, and then even the post imprisonment period, where we disenfranchise individuals and we continue to punish them. So like in the last presidential election, over 6.1 million Americans couldn't vote because they had felony convictions. And the vast majority of those are African American. So 1 out of, I think it's, I have to make sure I get this right, but it's something like 1 out of every 13 African Americans have permanently lost their voting rights in the United States. Right. I don't think that's by accident either. I think that it's built into a systemic system of disenfranchisement of certain groups, and also our kind of implicit attitudes we take towards crime have driven, I think, the kinds of devastation we're seeing, and now the uprising in reaction to that devastation of our criminal justice policies.
Doctor, how do you think we got here? I mean, obviously the concepts of restorative or rehabilitation for people who have been incarcerated is not foreign to us. They were concepts that we, at least at one point in time, utilized. How do we get from embracing those concepts to what has now become essentially, as you're stating, a purely punitive and retributive model?
Yeah. I want to mention that, you know, I target retribution quite often, but you know, I don't want to put all the blame on the feet of the turn towards retributivism, because a lot of the policies that drove mass incarceration were also focused on deterrence. So, like 3 strikes you're out laws, you know, these kind of laws that say 3 felonies and you get life in prison. Many of those were driven not as much from retributive impulses, but from the desire to deter crime. We thought if we, you know, had a kind of set sentence for certain types of offenses, this would deter, you know, would-be felons from committing felonies because they know they'll go to, you know, they'll spend life in jail. I reject those approaches as well, by the way. Not because of my philosophical reasons having to do with free will, but for purely moral reasons. I think that there are a number of moral problems that come with purely deterrence-based approaches to crime. It's been a combination of a retributive view of individuals combined with these kinds of tough on crime policies that could either be couched as deterrence-based or retributive. You know, there are different ways of defending these kind of policies, have driven individuals to this kind of, I don't know, the circumstances in which politicians have essentially had to outdo themselves of being tough on crime. So when you look at the history of the sort of rhetoric, you know, initially, you know, Democratic presidents were being, we're losing elections. You know, you could trace it back to, in a way, to you know, one of those early elections with who's the one who wore the helmet in the tank? I'm forgetting his name all of a sudden. Mondale. No, was it Mondale? No, it wasn't Mondale. I'll think of it. But the Willie Horton incident, where as a governor, he released a person in prison who had committed a heinous crime because they accepted a kind of a policy that he tried to furlough individuals so that they could spend some of their time working outside prisons and then report back. And when Willie Horton was on release, he committed another horrible crime.
Dukakis.
Oh yeah, Dukakis, right? Yeah, and so you know, he was leading in the polls until that incident, and when those ads began to run, his poll numbers dropped. And Republicans had seemed to have the upper hand for many years for being the tough on crime policy. But you can't blame just the Republicans, because when Bill Clinton eventually became president, he passed some of the most stringent. The crime bill was one of the worst bills in modern criminal justice reform that helped accelerate, poured gasoline on the mass incarceration crisis. And I think it had to do with a kind of idea that to appear strong, one had to adopt this kind of rhetoric of tough on crime, a kind of condemnation of criminals as bad people, as super predators, right? Remember the language of even Hillary Clinton in the last election was called out for having used those terms early on during the Clinton years. That was a common way of speaking of certain types of offenders, largely African-American offenders, right? And it was used as a kind of tool, I think, to ease people's fear of crime, whether that fear was legitimate or not, that's, crime rates were dropping, and they have been continuing to drop, and yet the tough on crime rhetoric still exists. And you get this with Donald Trump now wanting to be again the tough on crime candidate in the presidential election this year. He wants to appear to be the person, the law and order president, I think he said in one of his more recent speeches. But yet crime is at one of the lowest levels we've seen in modern history. There are some exceptions, like there's certain anomalies in certain cities like Chicago, which Trump is quick to point out. But for the most part, nationally across the board, numbers are down, crime rates are down, and yet incarceration rates are still going up.
Dr. Caruso, so I mentioned, Tola and I are both criminal defense attorneys, been in public defense before. I'm currently in private criminal defense, but I spent many years in doing public defense work. So, representing people charged with crimes that are indigent, that are too poor to pay for a lawyer. You're entitled to that. And obviously you are working on these issues from a data standpoint, from a philosophical standpoint, from an academic, but I'm sure Tola would agree with me that in my experience, the majority of my clients aren't committing these crimes because they are bad people. But really because they are themselves, like you say, victims of really their circumstances. I've come across prosecutors in my experience that take the approach, well, I came from a bad neighborhood. And I had a terrible upbringing, but I didn't commit crimes. What do you respond with that counter argument that, when it comes to free will, there are exceptions to that rule, of course, right? There are people.
Yeah, I mean, these are statistical, right? So there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. And so in those cases, I would just argue that there were other circumstances that were that played a role in that individual's life that allowed them to be able to overcome those other, social hurdles. So maybe they had an encouraging family. Maybe they had the luck of a good teacher who encouraged them early on, or a mentor who stepped into their lives and guided them in the right way. But a lot of that has to do with luck, which again is another factor beyond our control, right? I mean, we don't control circumstances of luck. And yet when you really think about it, you realize how much of who we are and what we do is really a byproduct of luck. We don't get to choose our initial circumstances of life. We don't get to choose our DNA. We don't get to choose our natural, predispositions or the lottery of life in terms of our initial conditions. We don't choose our parents. We don't have any control over those factors, but we also generally don't have any control over the socioeconomic situation we're born into the community we're born into. We have no ultimate control over our race and how that affects who we are and how people react to us and how we learn to react back to the world. We have no control over all of these various factors. You don't have any control over whether you're a child and abused by your parents or whether your parents are alcoholics. Now, you might be able to overcome those circumstances, but the reasons you overcome them are often because you have certain characteristics of fortitude or commitment that were also byproducts of luck. You didn't develop the kind of character that you have that allows you to, to overcome those circumstances or to forbear or to persevere to the extent that you did. And often if you look at your own lives, you find that there were situations in which, things that ultimately helped you along the way that are not of your own making, right? And if you begin to see things in that light, you may not have to become a free will skeptic, but you could easily begin to see that that individuals are the byproducts of the circumstances in which they find themselves. And crime has more to do with places and circumstances than people. And we could see this just statistically. Again, when you see that 90% of women who were imprisoned were themselves victims of violence in the past, well, isn't the most logical thing to do not to punish the women, but to try to prevent the violence? I mean, it's just an obvious kind of, thing to say. The thing that stops us, though, and I think the political hurdle, is there is a sort of, this is why I don't give up on the free will issue, and I think it is kind of important. There is a sort of ingrained notion, especially in the United States, of this rugged individualism, of being able to pick themselves up, from their bootstraps. And that's what you're capturing in that kind of, response you might get from a friend who says, well, I was born in the ghetto and I didn't turn out to be a criminal. That seems to imply it was all of my own doing, right? Like I just picked myself up from the bootstraps and overcame all of that on my own, which is just really a myth. It's not the case. And when you really dive down into it, one of the things that's stopping us is we fail to see that individuals are byproducts of these kind of systems. They're embedded in social systems that shape them. And the issues of luck are just easy ways to get people to see that. They could see, like, for example, if I threw you in Darfur or Rwanda or some third world nation where you were 13 years old and you had three choices. I shove a machine gun in your hand. I say, jump on the back of this pickup and start killing that group, or join that group and start killing this one, or to try to remain neutral and have your hands cut off or watch your sister be raped and mutilated in front of your eyes. If those are your life choices, you have to ask yourself, are you capable of committing criminal acts? And I think most people would realize that, yeah, at least in certain circumstances, they could easily see that they would. And if you could see that in yourselves, then you could see that, well, it's just a matter of luck I'm not in that situation. And if you could transport that to more mundane circumstances, where it isn't so obvious, but that those matters, those circumstances, those social factors are still shaping the conditions in which individuals are driven to commit these kind of criminal acts, then it's less about blaming them and more about preventing the circumstances and the conditions in the first place. Of course, we have to address issues once people end up committing criminal acts, but the goal is prevention. And so the focus should be there. And then I have a model for how do you deal with individuals after they've committed crime that's a non-punitive approach. But yeah, I would stress the kind of examples that you could use to leverage the recognition that it isn't wholly of their own making. Like if you remember a couple of years back, Obama gave this speech that caused some controversy because he said in the speech, if you've been a successful businessman, you didn't build it yourself. Remember? And the Republicans went kind of crazy because this idea, sort of an assault on this bootstrap idea, this causa sui, this I created myself out of nothing kind of idea. And they ran the presidential convention that year around, at least they dedicated one day of the convention around the slogan, yes, we did. Yes, we did. We built it ourselves. We succeeded all on our own. And if you look at the next sentence of Obama's speech, it was an innocuous, just factually correct statement that if you succeeded in business, you probably along the way had an encouraging teacher, he said, or maybe help in taxes from the government, or a loan from a family member early on to get your business started, or some set of opportunities, or or policies or programs or individuals that helped you take advantage of those circumstances that then allowed you to succeed. And so what we see is that there's not an equal playing field. And I think that's why the people are out on the streets right now. They realize the system is broken, it's rigged, and that not everyone is playing from an equal starting position. And we overly police certain types of infractions as well, which disproportionately then target Black and brown communities, right? So yeah, and let me just piggyback on what you were also saying about the economic factors and the real life situations that you're dealing with. If you look at the case like Khalif Brower, who was a 16-year-old youth who was arrested, I think on, if I get this right, suspicion of stealing a backpack. I think that was what the accused crime was. He was then put in Rikers Island for 3 years, waiting for a court date, simply because he couldn't afford bail, right? 3 years in Rikers Island. He was put in solitary confinement for those 3 years. They said for his own self-protection, because he was a minor in an adult institution. And eventually they released him and dropped the charges. He never was charged with a crime. They eventually just dropped the charges after 3 years. And the reason he was held is that he couldn't afford bail, right? And upon release, he committed suicide, right? And we know that solitary confinement causes that kind of psychological damage. With lots of empirical literature on the psychological effects of solitary confinement. And Khalid Brower, at 16 years old, spent 3 years in solitary confinement for suspicion of stealing a backpack. Now, if you think about everything that has gone wrong in that circumstance, the first thing is he was probably targeted for being Black. And he was in probably an overly policed neighborhood, right? So the number of police officers can affect the interactions with the police and the kinds of offenses or suspected offenses that people are targeted by the police for. So he's arrested probably because of hyperpolicing, right? And for targeting of certain neighborhoods, broken window policies, et cetera. For a crime that probably should be, decriminalized, or at least people shouldn't be put in Rikers Island for suspicion of stealing a backpack. It's a nonviolent crime, right? Then we have to deal with the broken bail problem, right? So this person was held primarily because they were poor and couldn't afford bail. Now we have to rethink, should we hold individuals and place them in Rikers Island awaiting a court date for a nonviolent offense as a minor, right, in this circumstance? And then he can't get a court date for 3 years, and then they drop the charges. And you have to think of the punitive environment in which he was held, the isolation, and the kind of deprivation he was exposed to, and the psychological harm that does to an individual. So the whole thing starts from the interaction on the street with the police officer and ends with the death of a 16-year-old for something about, again, think of also the Eric Gardner case in Staten Island, the one who was strangled to death, one of the first people who said, who uttered, "I can't breathe," right? What was he originally stopped for? Selling loosies. That is, selling single cigarettes, which is illegal. You can't take a pack of cigarettes and sell them one by one for $1. And that's what caused the interaction with the police officer. Well, one of the things we should do is decriminalize a lot of these low-level criminal offenses, because they give license for over-policing of Black and brown communities. And they cause these interactions that often lead to the death of African-American males, right? So the death of Eric Gardner was all stemmed from a police officer trying to take down an individual for what? Selling loosies, right? Well, that interaction should have never taken place in the first place, right? So decriminalizing many of the low-level nonviolent offenses would be one of the first things. In terms of policing, we need to demilitarize the police. I'm also a fan of this kind of defund the police. It depends on the rhetoric and how you use it. But what people need to understand with that kind of movement is it's not just defund the police. It's shrink the size of the police and reinvest that in those kind of social programs that I mentioned earlier that target things like housing, education, programs that interfere and prevent violence in the home. Things like nutrition even is tied to criminal incarceration rates. There's like a deficiency in omega-3s, for example. We know that environmental injustices negatively and disproportionately affect African-American communities, which cause poor health outcomes, but also higher incarceration rate, and the list goes on. So we could take a lot of that money and reinvest it in programs and policies that would address the social inequalities that then can reduce the criminal behavior in the first place. And I think we need to end broken window policies. So these were kind of policies that would, implemented by people like Giuliani and Manhattan early on, where he just didn't want to see homeless people on the streets in the business districts. He wanted to push them out. And so one of the things they did is they started policing these very low-level nonviolent offenses to essentially address issues about freeing up the business districts so people would feel comfortable and safe and they would be clean environments. But again, those kind of policies lead to an interaction like the one with Eric Gardner, right? Because you put in place laws that, criminalize certain types of offenses, primarily to target Black and brown communities, and then overly enforce them, causing an increase in interactions between police officers and Black youth, which then drive up all of these, unfortunate and very sad and unjust cases of police brutality.
So I guess the question would be, how do we start? Because, as a country, we seem to be one of contradictions in terms of we're ready to embrace that things are out of control when we say, but for the grace of God, go I. But at the same time, we do embrace this mindset that I can do everything on my own.
Yeah.
At the same time, with our criminal justice system and our prisons, it's out of sight, out of mind. So there's a lot for us as a nation to change in terms of our mindset. So where exactly do we get started?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and there's a lot of things to say. I mean, one is that there is a real focus on criminal justice reform at the moment, more so than I've ever seen in recent years, and I've been interested in these issues and working on them for many years. And I would say if you asked me that 10 years ago, I'd maybe be scratching my head with, a little bit of defeatism about how do we get people to recognize. I think people are there. There's more awareness now about mass incarceration than ever before. And you get weird, coalitions between the left and the right calling for criminal justice reform. So you have people like the Koch brothers now even calling for criminal justice reform. And now the reasons for that are interesting. Joseph Margulies, a law professor at Cornell University, has done some analysis on this, and he has a pretty interesting thesis, if I could float it real quick. One of his reasons for why there is a renewed interest in criminal justice reform, and also a renewed desire for second chances, realizing again that therefore the grace of luck or grace of God go I, is because the shade of skin of the people who have been recently incarcerated is beginning to shift. Okay, so the drug epidemic of the 80s and 90s were crack cocaine, and they were primarily hitting inner city African and African Hispanic communities. The drug epidemic at the moment is opiates, driven primarily by opiate addiction, and by but prescription opiate addiction, where people become addicted because of prescription drugs and then seek out other opiates, or meth. And these are hitting white rural communities. So Susie Q, white Susie Q is a cheerleader, Model A citizen, has an injury, she's prescribed a painkiller, gets addicted to painkillers, and then finds herself addicted to drugs, finds herself in circumstances now where she's homeless or she's turning tricks for money to pay for her addiction, and she ends up in the criminal justice system. And you have a renewed interest in criminal justice in part because people are starting to feel like, well, those aren't the people who should have ended up in the criminal justice system. It's a recognition that it's affecting members of their own community. And sadly, I think that one way to get people to get behind criminal justice reform is to recognize it affects everybody. And people are now realizing that because there's no community that's untouched in the United States by criminal justice. If you think about that, let me just get this statistic right. Yeah, it's a startling statistic. 1 in every 31 Americans, 1 out of every 31 people in the United States is somewhere within the criminal justice system. Probation, parole, prison, somewhere within that criminal justice net, 1 out of 31 Americans. So no longer is it the case, I think, that people don't have personal experience with someone who spent time in prison, or people don't have, people do now have personal experience with family members who are addicted to drugs. Or you have experience with individuals who are on parole or probation.
Sure. Dr. Caruso, if I could, and not only, you know, if people are starting, if there's a shift in the types of people that are being charged and placed into the criminal justice system, but even if you're someone that really doesn't care about, you know, social issues or people's rights, really, I mean, there can be an interest from a fiscal perspective.
Yeah, and so I think that's also why libertarians and conservatives have gotten behind it, because of the costs of mass incarceration have just been blown out of control. And we see that actually we save a lot more money adopting the preventative approach than the reactive approach. So just one example, educational programs in prison. One study found that just simply giving educational opportunities to prisoners reduced recidivism on its own by 40%. Okay. Now, economically and fiscally, what the study found is for every dollar they spent, it saved them $5. It saves the state $5. So you think about the costs of crime. There's the cost of the property loss and victims' costs. There's the cost of court costs. There's the incarceration costs. There's a whole set of costs that go into trying, convicting, and housing an individual for a crime. The preventative approach actually saves us money fiscally, because for every dollar we spend, we end up saving $5 in all of those external costs. If you just appeal to people's self-interest, they should see that it's in our self-interest, I think, to adopt preventative programs that fund things like education, universal access to healthcare, mental health services, all of these interventionist programs. And I could go through a lot of specific programs that I've written about and endorse. But that actually saves us money, and it makes us safer because it reduces recidivism. And when you humanize individuals and treat them like human beings and attempt to reintegrate them as quickly as possible back into society, that makes us better as a community. It makes us safer as a community.
Yeah, because I mean, you're ultimately addressing the cause and not the symptom of what is going on. And I really love your analogy, and I see that more and more these days. Comparing, our criminal justice system, if we were to take a public health model and apply it to the criminal justice system, I mean, I can even see it in regards to policing or prosecution, I mean, at that point, the police officer, the prosecution, or, the corrections officer is addressing the symptom of the problem. The problem, like you said, and many times is mental health, mental illness, poverty, lack of education, not having other options, substance abuse that goes untreated, and not having, money to pay for these things or resources available in your community. And so we address that cause. The symptom of it, but never really addressing that cause. Now, if we funneled all the money into, let's say heart surgeons, right? Yeah. And didn't put any money into, general physicians or education to take care of your health, that's not really going to do much good.
Or fund heart surgeons instead of funding research into heart disease and
or cancer, right?
And just to kind of give some specifics to that. I mean, the public health framework is actually, it's there. It's been developed over the years to deal with things like COVID-19, and now people actually have exposure to being quarantined and understanding how public health models affect and how those models actually work. But when you apply it in the criminal justice system, you use many of the same techniques. So you even adopt the kind of epidemiological approach to tracking crime, just very much like you would track disease transmission. And we all now, everyone's sort of, it's fluent to some extent because of the COVID pandemic about tracing and how this stuff works with apps, and how public health models actually can trace infection rates, and so then they could then try to isolate those communities to stop the spread. Same thing with criminal behavior. What we find, for example, just say like we know when on hot days in Chicago, when the temperature reaches 90 degrees Fahrenheit, crime rates go up. It's just a fact. More crime actually occurs on hotter days, partly because people are out on the streets and irritated too, and other kinds of factors. And what you realize is that one approach to try to defusing some of that situation is not always just policing those communities, but opening up air conditioning facilities or access to community pools, or in some communities, they actually open up the fire hydrants, and it actually has effect of driving down the crime rates. Now, you have to both be able to know what the drivers of that crime were, you have to model them, and then be able to track them and then target them, right? So Scotland actually adopted a public health approach to crime. They had one of the highest rates of murder in all of Europe. And they had a lot of problems with stabbings and facial slashings and things like this. Gangs and people carrying knives were causing a lot of cuttings. And so they adopted a public health framework to try to address this, what they consider sort of an epidemic of violence in the community. And they identified certain drivers of the crime. And ironically, well, maybe not so, maybe for some, obviously, they were things like toxic masculinity, unemployment, and alcohol. And so they took some really simple precautionary measures. They reduced last call in bars by half hour, I think. They implemented certain other, reasonable alcohol restrictions in certain places. They started a campaign of awareness about masculinity, and addressing toxic masculinity issues. They invested in school programs. And then they also addressed a holistic approach where you address individuals at every interaction with the system. So if I come into the emergency room with a stab wound, ER physicians were trained to identify a stabbing victim, look into, because usually if they're a victim, they're also part of a system that perpetrates violence. And what they looked at is the whole individual. And so why were they in the circumstance? What was the cause of the stabbing? And then they linked them up with social programs and social institutions like social services, housing, work training facilities, and they treated the individual holistically at the point of interaction in the emergency room. And you do the same thing in the classroom and the same thing at every point of interaction. And they actually cut murder rates in half within, I think it was 8 years, just by taking this public health approach to preventative measures to address violent crime. And it's been. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. No, I was just going to ask, because we have, and I don't want us to go too far over, and obviously I think we can all agree that prevention of crime would probably be the best solution, and ways to do that to address the social problems that in a lot of times cause people to get into that circumstance in the criminal justice system. But what is your, and I know you said you were writing on this, I'm curious to see if you can give us a sneak peek what your research is and what your opinion is on changing the prison system and the jail system and what that would look like.
Yeah, so on my view, no one is morally responsible for their actions in this basic desert sense, because I'm a free will skeptic. So let me just give you the analogy with quarantine real quick. So the idea is, like, say I get on a plane, so I contract Ebola, I get on a plane, and when I get off, they detain me and they quarantine me, right? They don't allow me into the country because I have Ebola. Well, if you think about it, right, free will skeptics like myself say individuals are not morally responsible in this basic desert sense for their wrongful actions. Well, this individual isn't morally responsible for having contracted Ebola, right? And yet we believe we're justified in incapacitating them, in quarantining them. And the justification for quarantining them is what I call a right of self-defense and protection of harm to others. That is, the society is allowed to quarantine the individual to prevent a pandemic, essentially. And we're all now relatively familiar with this idea because of the COVID crisis. So this has helped me in my model a little bit because people are more aware of this in their daily lives. And so you could justify limiting one's liberty without appealing to retribution without appealing to deterrence, without talking about free will, without appealing to moral responsibility, without mentioning giving this individual just desserts, i.e. we're justifying quarantining this individual on the grounds of the right of self-defense and protection of harm to others. And so my model would say that in terms of people who commit seriously violent crimes, we might also be justifying incapacitating them on similar grounds, i.e. the right of self-defense and protection of harm to others, analogous to the justification for quarantine. But having said that, major reforms would have to follow, and this gets me to the prison component. For one, no individual should be treated cruelly or inhumanely, right? So let's say you hold me in quarantine for my Ebola. Well, you have the right to limit my liberty, but you don't have the right to dehumanize me. None of my other rights should be removed. And so I've actually proposed something from a Norwegian criminal justice system called the principle of normality. And this is actually part of the system in Norway. It's an official policy of the correctional system in Norway. And the principle of normality says conditions inside prison should resemble conditions outside prison as much as possible. Secondly, it says that the individual, no right has been removed by the sentencing court except the limiting of liberty is the only right that's been limited by the sentencing court. No other rights should be removed by the individual. So let's say you're justified in quarantining me because I have Ebola. Well, you're not justified in removing my voting rights.
Right.
And so I actually have argued that not only should we reinstate voting rights for ex-felons, I think individuals who are actually incarcerated or incapacitated should retain their voting rights. And so that means prisons no longer can serve punitive purposes. The goal has to be rehabilitation and reintegration. So if I have Ebola, you're justified in quarantining me, but you also have a moral duty to treat me and then release me the minute I'm no longer a threat to society. And so on my model, the only grounds we have for incapacitating an individual is the protection of society. If an individual poses no threat to society, we have no grounds for limiting their liberty. And so for almost all nonviolent crimes, my model would recommend something short of incarceration, short of incapacitation. That might be mental health services for people with mental health needs, drug treatment for people with addiction, monitoring in some cases, or decriminalization, as I mentioned earlier, of many things that we currently incarcerate people for. So for the very few people who would then need to be incarcerated, and now we've already limited to a very small subset of seriously violent criminals who pose a continued threat to society, we have a right to incapacitate them, but only in humane conditions under the principle of least restriction, meaning we adopt the least restrictive measures necessary to protect public safety. We have to adopt the principle of normality, which means the conditions of prisons should be designed so that the situations, the physical environment should resemble the circumstances that they're going to return to as much as possible. And that's because if you want seamless integration of individuals back into society, you want them to integrate from a familiar environment back into a familiar environment. What our prison systems do is they strip you naked the minute you arrive. They house you in cages. They deprive you of educational and enrichment programs, of mental health services, often drug treatment. And that instills a kind of learned helplessness. So when individuals are released, they can't manage their autonomy because they've had every aspect of their lives controlled for the last 20 or so years. When they wake up, when they go to sleep, where they go, where they report to, what time they, have to be back in their cell. Every aspect of their lives is managed. The Norwegian system actually has prison designs like Bastau Island and Horton prison, where they have a number of things like they maximize interaction between prisoners, which US prisons try to minimize. US prisons are devoid of vegetation, for example, and shrubbery, often for sight lines, for visibility. Actually, these places like Horton and Bastau Island, these are places that actually encourage interaction, both among the prisoners and in interactions between police or guards and prisoners. Bastow Island, in fact, there are no fences, no barbed wire walls, no. They have blueberry fields. They actually, the one, Bastow Island is actually a low max prison. Horton prison is a super max prison. Both of them, though, have maximum autonomy. Prisoners have access to knives because they have training in being chefs. They have a recording studio. They live in little autonomous pods, which require them to crisscross the campus throughout the day to maximize interaction. Because if you want people to facilitate better interpersonal skills, you have to have them interacting with other individuals. And what they've learned is there's been no escape attempts, very little violence within the prisons. Prisoners and guards are encouraged to form friendships. People allowed to personalize their spaces. So hang pictures on the wall, posters, photos of their families. And they're given maximal autonomy and work training and educational enrichment programs that try to give them the skills necessary to better reintegrate. And let me just add, lastly, again, in those systems, generally speaking, 90% of prison sentences are less than a year. And they don't have out of control crime. They have the lowest rate of recidivism in the world, 20% recidivism rate. Now, of course, a lot of disanalogies. They don't have the problems of racism or systemic poverty that we have and things like that. But that's part of also that preventative aspect of my model that I think we have to invest in.
And, you know, I see a lot of times, at least from the law enforcement correction standpoint, a lot of the restrictions on liberties are the reasoning, at least from that perspective, is safety, not only for the public, but safety for the individuals incarcerated, that they do not want to provide them with other things because they can be used as weapons, right? So they try and limit the types of items and resources that they have in custody because they're concerned someone might use that as a weapon against someone else, when, you know, in this model, that would potentially be the more dangerous prisoners. How does your model respond to that?
It seems like that's an empirical question, right? And so some of the empirical stuff I've looked at is actually like there are small pilot programs, even in the United States, that have experimented with certain wards of prisons, giving them more autonomy and treating them in more humanizing ways. And actually, you know, they discover when they treat an individual humanely, they learn to react in ways that are more humanistic, right? And so you treat an individual like an animal, they're going to act like an animal. And so we have to begin to look at individuals not as criminals, but as individuals who happen to fall into certain kinds of circumstances. Again, I could have very easily been that individual if I were in their circumstances. And when we begin to look at individuals as persons and not just judge them by the worst act they've committed, right? But as individuals who are holistic individuals that have holistic needs, you have to then address those needs. Now, you're right, there is concern for safety, but a lot of it, you know, also stems from other problems. Like over 50% of people in prison in the United States have mental health issues. And part of that reasoning is because our prisons have become de facto mental health institutions. They shouldn't have been there in the first place, but this is what happened actually. And this is what my fear is, in part with the defund the police rhetoric, partly, is that there was abuses in the past in mental facilities back in the 60s and 70s. There's a lot of stories people might have heard about. And so there was a call to shut these institutions down because of the systemic abuse. But that was supposed to be step one in a two-step process. The second process was to be to reinvest that money in better mental health services. And what happened, like many things in the United States, is they did step one, but never did step two. They defunded and closed down the institutions, but never reinvested. And that's never going to work, right? And so what happened was once you close down those institutions, our prisons became de facto mental health institutions. And so yeah, sure, there might be safety issues, but many of those might be caused by problems that are, you have a individual who's schizophrenic and isn't on their meds, or doesn't have access to their meds, or isn't properly diagnosed, or doesn't have the mental health services that they deserve. That all has to be addressed differently. And so that begins so there's another model that was piloted in the Bronx. And as a defense attorney, you may be familiar with some of these. It was called a holistic, it's called something like a holistic defense approach. And it was piloted in the Bronx, where they essentially looked at individuals, you might be aware of this program, holistically. And what they did is they asked individuals who were brought in, do you want to be tried in this sort of alternative docket court, right? And essentially to do so, they sign away their habeas corpus to a degree. And they say that they'll agree to whatever the committee of experts essentially proposes. And the committee is made up of representatives for the victim, representatives from the defense team, from the prosecutor, but also social services, mental health experts, addiction experts. And they look holistically at the individual. Do they have stable housing? Do they have a stable job? Do they have mental health needs? Do they have addiction issues? And they work, this is an alternative to incarceration. And then they work holistically as a team to get that person the programs that they need. Again, to avoid incarceration. The person then has to, let's say it's a drug conviction case. He has to agree to, say, drug testing, to say that he's consistent with the program and things like that. But if you make it through the program, and it might be, let's say, a 9-month program or a 12-month program, and you have come out at the other end, not committed any additional crimes, now have a stable situation with a stable job and stable housing, and you remain clean, your record is cleared. Charges are dropped. And they found that actually these programs have been highly effective. Individuals who've gone through that program, in terms of rates of recidivism or coming back into the court system, are exponentially lower than people who haven't gone through the holistic defense approach. And so all of those would be better approaches to addressing an individual even after they've committed the crime, if it's a nonviolent crime and stems from these kind of situations. Now, the problem is it requires a lot of money and a lot of time. And so you need investment in the programs to fund those kinds of institutions. Again, you can't just defund the police force or defund the mental health institutions and not reinvest.
And so you need to be able to fund the individual that's participating in that program. I think that's one of the disadvantages that I've seen in my work with some diversionary programs like drug court mental health.
Yeah, drug court dockets, yeah.
Is that even if you have the resources from the community to make that court and have those resources, people that don't have money sometimes can't drive there. Yeah. They can't take off work. Yep. They can't have daycare for their kids. And these are very demanding programs sometimes that people are really set up to fail occasionally.
Yeah, so an interesting point, because when I was in Scotland, I wrote most of my book while I was on sabbatical in Scotland. And I met with a judge who was interested in my work and had read some of it and wanted to meet with me. And so I was asking him, about his own role as a judge and sentencing. And he was talking a lot about these knife cases, these individuals, these youth who were carrying knives. And one of the problems stems simply from making it to that stage. And what he realized is a lot of the cases escalate because charges have been drawn, court date has been issued, and then the individual doesn't show up to the court date, either because they don't have money or because they work multiple jobs and they don't have a stable kind of job, so they can't afford to take the day off without jeopardizing losing their shift or being able to pay their rent that month. And so they don't show up, not out of negligence or just disregard, but out of kind of real life circumstances. Then they get a warrant out for their arrest. And then you get this escalation. And what we've ended up with essentially in the United States is, although it's the Supreme Court has made it illegal, it's definitely reared its head again, is pauper jails. That is, jails that are filled with people who are simply there because they can't pay the fines, or they can't pay the bail, or because of an escalation of fines and costs, court costs and other costs, defense costs, that they end up being incarcerated, not for really any initial crime, but for all these secondary outcomes. So we need to be mindful of bringing people into the system when the system itself is broken. And one of the other things I would add to that is that we also have to disconnect issues of justice from revenue creation. Our criminal justice system has unfortunately wrapped up these issues. So just to take ticketing, for example, if you've been caught speeding, and I unfortunately have recently a couple of times, the tickets are now up to like $400. And not only the $400, I get assessed a year or so later with additional taxes, and then my insurance rates also go up. And so that one initial infraction may cost me substantially. But let's say I can't afford $400, but I'm a driver and I make my living as an Uber or Lyft driver. And because I can't afford the $400 fee, I end up with a suspended license. And then I get pulled over for a taillight, and I get arrested for other offenses. And then it escalates, and then I get a court date, and I can't show up at the court date. And then now there's another warrant, and this escalates. And now that I'm serving prison time for essentially the same infraction that I received, but because I'm white, middle class, and able to afford the fine, I don't end up in jail, and he ends up in jail for the same exact infraction.
Yeah, and I mean, we're in Charleston here, Dr. Caruso. I mean, we have, a few years ago with Walter Scott, and then that, in his case, it wasn't traffic tickets, but it was inability to pay his child support, which, a lot of people think is counterintuitive. Why would you suspend someone's license and prevent them from being able to go to work if they can't make their child support? That's not going to solve anything.
That's right.
You create these police interactions, and
that's part of the punitive versus reactive approach. The punitive thing is to further load on the punishments, but that is making it harder and harder for that individual to do the right thing, to overcome, to be the kind of person we want them to be, right? And it's just going to make it more difficult.
So how do we change that general mindset? Because I know you mentioned earlier, working towards self-interest, but my concern with self-interest is one, that we're a nation that primarily works in that manner already, and also detachment. And I think that generally, in terms of the hierarchy of the people within this country, is that it defeats that overall self-interest in terms of how it'll benefit the community. How do we change from that mindset of, if it doesn't affect me, I'm not too worried about it, to, as a society as a whole, this will greatly benefit us?
Yeah, I think, there are multiple ways one has to do it. I mean, one is, adopt a pluralistic approach, right? For those who are more susceptible to hear cost arguments, explain to them how we could save money and reduce, the budget by investing in prevention and reducing the cost of mass incarceration. For those who are concerned with issues of social justice, right? Point out the fact that, a lot of this has to do with certain initial social injustices and inequalities in the first place. I think the luck argument works really well, I've noticed, when you actually could bring out, by just normal everyday examples, cases where, like even the case I just used with the ticket, how that's another issue of luck. It's just a matter of luck that I'm an individual who's able to pay for that assessment of a $300 fine, and that individual isn't. And for the same crime, I end up, going on in my life, he ends up in jail. That's not driven by anything to do with the character of an individual or their responsibility, but purely by circumstantial factors like luck and economic, issues. I think that we need to look at the costs, the hidden costs of mass incarceration, the hidden costs of over-policing. And I think, again, every once in a while, these cases like the George Floyd case bring the public's attention to these issues. And I hope that now the attention stays focused. My feeling is that this is different than previous cases. I hope there's sustained interest and investment and real reform now. But I think that, we need to recognize how broken the system is, how it disaffects individuals, how this is not good for democracy, how this is not good for our nation, how it's not good for us as individuals, how we would have safer societies. And also, I think, just generally speaking, we have to get past the idea of viewing, crime in this way, where it's a matter of giving individuals their just desserts. We have to look at understanding the fact that individuals find themselves in circumstances and become the individuals they are largely because of factors beyond their control. And so once you begin to recognize that, I mean, I've always had this deep-seated kind of, I don't know where it came from or why I acquired it, but this real acknowledgement that the lottery of life is not always fair. And early on in my life, it kind of was, and it stuck with me through my youth to my current work, that, a lot of where individuals find themselves and the circumstances and opportunity, like, I'll just give you a crazy one, it has nothing to do with crime. Some of you probably read Malcolm Gladwell's various books like Tipping Point and Blink and Outliers. But I think it's Outliers, he has this example, pretty weird example, but it's good to bring out the point I'm trying to make, where he found this anomaly where disproportionate number of hockey players in the NHL had birthdays that clustered in 2 months. Let's just say it was December, January. I think that's what it was, but I'll just say that. And it was something like statistically, way beyond chance, like 70-something% of professional players had birthdays that fell in these 2 months, and how could that be? And what he found is that the vast majority of them come from Canada, and they start playing hockey at a very early age. And so they're put in the Pee Wee leagues at ages 4 or 5, just at the point at which they're able to start walking. They're put on skates and they're put in the Pee Wee leagues. And what he discovered was the cutoff point for the age of whether you'd be the oldest or the youngest in the league was dependent on your birthday. And if your birthday fell in December or January, you were the oldest in that league. And if your birthday was right after that, you were the youngest. Now, this is a matter of luck, right? No one freely controls when they're born. No one is responsible for the date of their birth. It's a matter of contingency of birth, the lottery of life. And simply at ages 4 or 5, imagine being almost 12 months developmentally superior to the kid next to you on skates. So you really have a 4-year-old versus a 5-year-old, essentially, on the same team. That's a huge developmental difference at that age. You get better hand-to-eye coordination, better stability on the skates, you're physically bigger. So you do better, not because you're naturally gifted or better skilled, because you're just literally older. So the next league up, you're given elite coaching, you're put on the elite team, maybe you play tougher players, maybe as you snowball up, you're put in an elite league, you're given better equipment and training facilities. And so this initial inequality that really begins about, when your birthday falls and how old you're gonna be when you enter the league, ends up having an effect on whether you make it successfully into the NHL. Now this goes back to your initial question early at the beginning when you said your colleague who might say, well, I was born in those circumstances and I didn't end up in jail. Well, maybe your birthday's in July and you made it to the NHL. Good for you. You were lucky too. But you have to realize that the deck was stacked against you and that other people had a disproportionate advantage based on the way the system is organized, right? And we've also found that very similar things happen in education. So we know that kids who are the youngest in their class often are diagnosed, especially with boys, diagnosed with attention deficit disorder at higher rates than their fellow students. That just might be because at that age, sitting still for 6 hours straight is more difficult for a 4-year-old than a 3-year-old. And there might be other reasons that go into why people perform the way they perform. And so because if we know these causes, solutions could be designed. So one solution is to have rolling admissions, right? To start things in segments of 4 months or have schools that don't start just one time a year, but have 4 different starting points that are better assessed on grade, et cetera. So just like all these factors of luck, if you explain to people and you use examples like this hockey example, and you talk to people about just weird cases where you could see how outcomes are the byproducts of factors that are due to social structures and social determinants and not factors of the individual per se, that means the system has to be addressed less than the individual. Of course, you have to deal with the serial killer at the tail end, and I have that model with quarantine and incapacitation that allows me to incapacitate that person, but also caring about their well-being and rehabilitating and reintegrating them. But the goal is also to then address those kinds of interventions that we know will work because we know what the causes are.
And thank you. We have one last question from somebody who's watching. They want to know if you considered UBI.
UBI, could they explain UBI?
The comment reads, strikes me as a fantastic blanket way to raise the floor and take a chunk out of so many of the causes of criminality and lack of opportunity.
Yeah.
You familiar with the term of UBI?
No, could they explain that for me?
Let's see if we can get a response.
While we're waiting on that, Dr. Caruso, I really love, you have a lot of work out there. One of the great lines from your TED Talk, which I'm going to be posting, so everyone can watch the TED Talk, which is great, by the way. And it's incredible how you're able to cram everything that you said into those few minutes. Yeah. Oh my gosh. But I think that the big takeaway that I got from it was really, that you said, instead of blaming people and punishing them on the tail end, we should try to prevent the criminal behavior in the first place. Is that really the gist of, what you're saying when it comes to your theories in relation to the criminal justice system, is really addressing the preventative aspects of it and not the punishment part or the retribution, the justice efforts at the tail end? Yeah,
and I didn't talk that much tonight about it, but I do think that the role that free will plays and the concepts of just desserts occasionally stand in the way of policy implication of these, politicians implementing these. So, you've asked several times, it seems like common sense, right? Almost everything I'm saying sounds very much like, well, that's just obvious. Yeah, we should prevent the thing from happening. But one of the things that stops people from doing it is there's just this overriding commitment, especially in the United States, of this kind of rugged individualism. And people can't get past the fact that individuals somehow don't deserve the circumstances they find themselves in. So like if you're in poverty, it's because you don't work hard enough, right? And if you're in jail, it's because you're a bad person. And if you've been raped, it's probably because you did something to, bring it upon yourself. So we have this kind of blame the victim type mentality where we see individuals as somehow deserving of the outcomes that they end up finding themselves in. And that's because we believe that I could have overcome that. I'm an individual. And so I know if I was born in the ghetto, I wouldn't commit crimes. I know that I would be able to, use my you wouldn't have had the educational opportunities, or you wouldn't have had, we have to assume the circumstances in which we're talking about. People who have, broken homes, or mothers that work, multiple jobs. We know that poverty affects brain development, for example. We know that, for example, kids that grow up in low socioeconomic status homes have thinner prefrontal cortexes, less gray matter. And part of the explanation is that, there's multiple explanations, and that might be more controversial, but part of the explanations could be things like high stress environments affect brain development. So if you live in a community where there are high levels of violence, you're going to have high levels of stress, and stress is going to affect brain development in terms of hormone release and amygdala activity and all kinds of other things. There's also aspects like the amount of words used per day in a household. And so vocabulary and interaction between parents and children are going to be affected by economic issues. Like, is the mother capable of, like, I've been thinking about all the educational inequity that's been compounded during this pandemic due to homeschooling. Because I've had the opportunity, and my wife had the opportunity, to spend all this time with my daughter, helping her with her homeschooling. But that's because I was able to stay home, because as a professor, we went online, and my wife was able to be home because her job allowed her to be home. And we have the education that allows us to understand the materials she's studying and to help her with it. Not all households have all of those kind of resources, even just access to books within the home or access to the internet. And we're going to see a disproportionate effect in educational attainment when we go back, I think, in the fall, because of the effects of homeschooling. And so we know that all of these things like poverty could affect brain development, which then affects moral development, which then affects other kinds of things. So it begins at the, at the root of the cause. And yeah, you got to get past the political opposition of recognizing that investment in programs is not just the smartest thing, it's the just thing to do, and it's the rational thing to do, because individuals are not self-made.
And so in the meantime, Dr. Caruso, our viewers clarified UBI standing for Universal Basic Income.
Oh, yeah.
Gets monthly payment that would raise them above the relative poverty level.
Yeah, so I've read a lot about it, and I don't have a particular stand. What I've looked at, I generally find encouraging. I think it's worked in certain pilot programs I've looked at. Other data I've seen is that it's not as effective, but I have in my book 12 policy proposals I propose, and some of them are things like universal access to healthcare. I don't offer a universal basic income proposal, although I might favor one personally. I do look at housing though, and so there are some pilot programs that have just, again, the hidden costs of homelessness are really great, and it actually saves money in many cases, providing individuals with homes, let's say. It's very much like universal basic income. And in the pilot programs where they've done this, not only has it saved money, it's increased well-being, life expectancies, and reduced recidivism, criminal behavior and incarceration and recidivism. Because there's a link between homelessness and incarceration, and it's a two-way link. People who are in homeless conditions of home instability are more likely to find themselves incarcerated, and people who are incarcerated are more likely to find themselves in conditions of homelessness upon release. And so simply providing individuals with basic housing free has actually worked in some communities. And the thing that, again, politically people might resist is the politics of that. People on the right see these as handouts, and so they oppose them. But when you explain to them, it actually saves them money. These programs save us money in the long run, especially when you think about the fact that some states have actually criminalized homelessness. So it's a criminal offense to sleep in public spaces, and then we incarcerate them simply for their homelessness. That actually shifts the burden to the taxpayer in terms of funding,
and funding the corrections institutions and the police and everything like that. I mean, I can't tell you how grateful we are to have you here. And I definitely, I knock on wood with your statement earlier that I really hope that people, that this doesn't go away. And most importantly, that people recognize and realize that policing is just the tip of the iceberg. Like with the things that you're talking about and dealing with, the causes versus, the punishment, the incarceration rates, all those things. Police don't sentence people. Police do not sentence people to 20 years in jail and prison for possession or trafficking cocaine. That is something that is done by the judiciary. That is something that is done by the prosecutors. That is something that is permitted and sometimes required by the legislature. So these are three different entities that are not included in policing. And yes, the contact can start there, but that's just where it begins. And we need to really dive deep into every aspect of the criminal justice system to make sure that it is fair and equitable. That's what we're trying to do here. We're so grateful for you. I know Tola is going to close up, but is there any other closing words you wanted to say, Dr. Caruso?
No, thank you. I just would like to thank you for the work you guys are doing, and I've had a pleasure speaking with you. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Caruso, once again. And just for everybody who's watching, you can rewatch this again. We have all of our videos saved. Once again, this is episode 3 of our series, and I think we're just gonna keep on going with these. I know I find them fascinating and edifying, and I'm sure many of you do. Just make sure you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. Like our pages. We have more information and resources. We'll also have additional information on Dr. Caruso, his literary works, and things of that nature posted on the website as well. So once again, thank you all. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.